markers. That was pretty informative. And the next speaker is Cassidy from Centrifuge.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so my name is Cassidy. I work at a company called Centrifuge based in Berlin. Today I'm going to talk about bridging DeFi and the real world, and specifically how to use bonding curves within that to open up access to the financial system. So I'm going to start today with Centrifuge, and what we do is in terms of tokenizing real world assets. Then I'm going to go into our dApp called Tin Lake, and that's how we connect these real world assets into the DeFi ecosystem. And then I'm going to jump into the bonding curve aspect of the presentation and putting the D back in DeFi. So really asking the question, can we actually make this more decentralized? And then hopefully have some time for your questions at the end. Otherwise, we can always do questions after all the presentations. Happy to answer any of the questions you have. So jumping in, so raise your hand if you've ever issued or received an invoice. Awesome. Okay, so that is the main focus point of Centrifuge. So our mission is to change the rules of global trade to foster economic opportunity everywhere. And where we focused on first was invoices. Oftentimes, if you send an invoice, it takes, on average in the world, 60 days to actually get paid. But if you are an artist and you make music, it could take you 6 months to get paid. So that's where we were kind of starting from. The global B2B spend, just to get an idea of the size of the issue, that's invoices, right? That's $180 trillion. And only $3 trillion of that is addressed through factoring, which is the most common way of getting financing for those invoices. Supply chain finance or reverse factoring is about $200 billion, and the biggest player in that space, Talia, is only 10% of that. So this is the issue that we're kind of dealing with here. So what Centrifuge actually does, so we have a peer-to-peer layer that allows us the exchange of financial business documents in a private, secure, and verifiable way, an unalterable and single source of truth for all of the parties involved. And what that lets you then do is to be able to tokenize those documents and access the Ethereum DeFi ecosystem. So how does that actually work? Well, let's say we have a business, paper records, they sign and send an invoice from using the Centrifuge peer-to-peer network to Spotify. Spotify receives that invoice, they verify it, they verify all the details in it, and they sign it as well. So then what we use Ethereum for, we have the identity for both of those nodes, so that they're able to verify each other. And then we also anchor a signed document hash of that invoice. And so then using those elements, what we're able to do is mint an NFT that represents that real world asset, that invoice. And then say you want to use that NFT for financing, well, third parties like financing providers can actually request access to that confidential information within the invoice that's not included as part of the NFT. So still allowing some private data for those businesses while being able to verify the important elements on chain. So how do we connect this to the DeFi ecosystem? Let's say you have this NFT, you want to get funding for your invoice. What do you do next? How do you actually get financing for this? So we start with the Centrifuge peer-to-peer network. My transition suite didn't work out so well. Then we add the NFTs, and then our last layer here is our dApp Tin Lake that's built on top. And what Tin Lake is doing is going from the asset to the token and bridging it to the DeFi ecosystem. How is that working? Bear with me here. So you put the NFT into a deposit contract within the Tin Lake ecosystem of smart contracts. What we then do is mint collateral value tokens that are specifically just for the purpose of monitoring the value of those NFTs. So say this NFT is worth 100 euros, you would mint 100 collateral value tokens, and you would put those into a compound lending pool, into a CDP in Maker. So instead of leaving it up to Compound or Maker to specifically finance each individual NFT, which would be so tedious and not scalable and not practical at all, we've created this system to allow that to happen a bit more effortlessly using this collateral value token. And then from those lending pools or from the CDP, being able to withdraw some type of stablecoin, maybe it's DAI, and give that to the borrower. So an example, paper records would put that invoice into a pool of invoices using TinLake and be able to get DAI out of that system. So this is an example dashboard of what TinLake looks like today. So then how do we actually decentralize this further? Where does the D come in here? Well, it's really in that pool of invoices. There is an admin controlling this pool of invoices, and that admin is saying what that NFT is worth. Is this worth 100 euros? And if it is, what am I willing to lend against that 100 euros? What is the principle of this invoice? And so they're providing expertise, the valuation of the NFTs, the risk assessment, as well as what interest rates I want to charge on this, based on how risky I think it is. And they're also providing an element of liquidity in terms of being an underwriter and putting actually some of their own value at risk here in case some of these assets default. So the question I want to ask and what I want to propose to you is, what if this admin could be a DAO? And so this is something that isn't live, unlike everything else I've just talked about. This is still just brainstorming, but bear with me. So let's say the admin, instead of actually being in control of all of those other things, is only in control of the initial parameters. So joining terms for this DAO. And specifically, can other underwriters join this deployment? Do I want other people to participate in this? So giving the option of actually decentralizing this. Maybe there's a whitelist for people that I think are specifically experts in real estate finance that I want to be able to join. Maybe I think it's a really, really specific asset class that I want to target here. Maybe I just want to be able to vote on who's able to join. Or I can make it completely open and allow any underwriter to join. And maybe I use a bonding curve in order to determine how lucrative it might be for someone to want to join later on. So if it's a really steep bonding curve, maybe it's just really inconvenient for someone to, or not profitable for someone to want to join. So that's how much additional reward the initial underwriters could get for that initial risk. There could also be a voting governance on the leverage ratio for this pool. So the value that they're putting at risk to begin with, and then how that determines how much value of the assets they're able to lend against. So this would be important for something like talking to the MKR community of MakerDAO and saying, well, we want to have a leverage ratio of 100 times. But then they might just turn down your proposal for including this TinLake pool in Maker. And so then there's an incentive here to be able to find a leverage ratio that works best with the financing providers that you're targeting. And then finally, the fees that you want to charge on top of whatever other fees the actual lending providers are taking. So imagine that TIN is the name of the token of this specific deployment for invoices. So ITIN, let's say. So it gives the token holders governance rights over the deployment. So specifically, it can be asset curation. So specifically like curation markets, that could be one way that this works. There could be fees charged for access to the funding. There could be how much of a payment for the assets that have defaulted, how exactly the defaulting works, what are they called again? My mind is escaping. But basically auctioning off the assets if they did default and getting a collections agency, that's the word, to then take over those assets. And then finally, worst case scenario, winding down the deployment. So, voting mechanisms, training terms. What the economics could look like. So, DAI fees that are actually charged to the users for getting the funding for their NFT, they could actually go into the reserve of this bonding curve. And so then these ITIN tokens would be redeemed for those fees. One of the potential problems that we might have to deal with here is front running whenever fees are paid into this reserve. So one way to mitigate that is to have, I guess basically what is known as a Dutch auction, so that you have a period of time where people could say, I want to redeem my 10 tokens, and then redeem all of the ones that are able to be redeemed after that time period is ended. So then being able to mitigate front running if there are thousands of underwriters who want to liquidate at the same time. So therefore these tokens are increasing in value as it collects fees, cashing out and liquidating. Another thing that we want to prevent is when assets are actually being financed, that the outstanding debt is less than the reserves that are actually in the pool times the leverage ratio. And so preventing this attack here by addressing that issue. Another thing that we can do is when these TIN tokens are used to vote on assets that are actually financed, whichever underwriter within that pool actually voted for this asset to get financed, those tokens are locked until the asset's actually been repaid. So preventing another attack there of someone coming in and trying to dump all of their bad assets and exiting the bonding curve before those assets are actually repaid. So this is just an example of what it could look like. Maybe you have a slightly linear curve. Maybe it's completely flat, and you just want it to be a mechanism for being able to distribute underwriting. We can also add incentives for active participation. So perhaps we can mint new tokens every period, let's say. And all of those tokens are distributed only to the token holders who voted for assets that didn't default within the last period. So incentivizing participation, but not just participation that's actually valuable for the whole group of underwriters. So I would say the goal of this mechanism is really to enable greater access to the financial system through DeFi and unlock value here that's been inaccessible. If there's greater access to providing underwriting, there are a lot of companies out there actually who have a lot of data that would be able to perform services like this, valuating assets. And it would allow a lot of people, businesses today, to get access to financing that don't have it right now. So the objectives are really to facilitate trustlessness by incentivizing this valuation of assets, as well as creating a distributed risk assessment. By spreading it out across many different underwriters, there could be one who specifically focuses on identity and being able to prove identity of the different holders of NFTs, real-world assets. There could be one that focuses on credit scores, and they can all be a part of the same pool and distributing the risk assessment that way. So I would say the open access to participation really leads to greater access for financing. The decentralization should lead, I think, to increased participation in the valuation and the risk assessment. And I think all of those things together reduce the overall risk of the system. And I think funding sources will find more transparency as a result of this entire process of underwriters actually having to prove to each other that this asset is worth financing, and clear definitions of the value of the assets, the estimated risk, should hopefully reduce the fees as well for the entire system through the transparency. So, thank you. Yeah, open it up to questions.
So I hadn't heard of Tinlake before, and it sounds really cool, and I want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. So would it be an accurate analogy to say the same way that Maker issues dollar stablecoin DAI backed by over-collateralized debt positions, Tinlake is producing a stablecoin of euros or whatever currency the invoices are denominated, backed by like actual commercial paper, like invoices that are going to be paid back by companies?
Yeah, I mean, this, okay, let me go back to the chart so that I know exactly what you're talking about. So what Tinlake is doing is creating these collateral value tokens that I guess would be stable in a sense, but they're really just a representation of the value of the NFT. So we're still relying on the stablecoin of a DAI or USDC or whatever to then lend that to the borrower. I mean, theoretically, we could issue a stablecoin, but I think that should really be based on a more diverse system. And I think the reason why we're interested in working with someone like Maker is because ideally they're bringing on lots of different types of assets in addition to ours. And that makes, I believe that makes their stablecoin more stable.
Like the thing that seems really exciting about it is that it's not over collateralized anymore. It's just like a market for real debt that can actually be like more effective than the like to me, over collateralized definitions are neat but not really cool. But if you have a stablecoin backed by not over collateralized definitions like just real debt, that seems really cool.
Yeah, I agree.
I have a question with this diagram. The collateral value token, it's not a token for every invoice, right? It is for a pool of invoices.
So the idea here is that using Maker as an example, there would be one CDP open for this entire Tin Lake pool. So every invoice that comes in is a different NFT, but the collateral value tokens are managed by this admin, and they just determine how many collateral value tokens they mint.
Okay, so there is someone that assesses the risk of a specific invoice and decides this we're going to issue only these amount of collateral value tokens, and then if it's someone that always gets paid or whatever, it's like it's like less risk, more collateral value tokens.
Potentially, yeah. So, or it could also depend on the asset. So, if it was an invoice, they are generally very unlikely to default, depending on where the invoice is coming from. So then you'd probably value it at almost 100% of its value. So if it was worth 100 euros, maybe you mint 99 collateral value tokens.
Okay, gotcha.
I have two questions. First, does Maker already accept your CDTs for their CDBs?
No. So multi-collateral DAI is not live yet. And so this is something that right now the individual admin for a Tin Lake pool will put a proposal together for Maker holders to say we want our assets to be
What's your
included.
roadmap for that, or like, do you think like Maker will accept it?
I hope so. I mean, I think that they should. I think that it makes sense within the system. I think it'll actually bring the risk of the entire system down, especially if these are good assets. If it's things like mortgages or invoices from Nike or Adidas, I mean, these are assets that are very unlikely to default.
Yeah.
And ideally, if it's spread across many different countries, you're also taking away that risk. I know a lot of people who are really crypto heavy think that there's risk of governments shutting down and changing laws, which one doesn't really happen that often, but two, if it did, as long as you're distributed across real estate in many different countries, that also shouldn't matter. If this pool is real estate of all major cities, then if some of the assets default because Japan decided that they didn't want to allow real estate to be in crypto anymore, then all of the reserve in that pool could then be used, and you could just auction off those assets off-chain. For example,
what target factorization ratio? What's your target factorization ratio?
for the collateralization, that really depends on the asset, and that
For
depends.
CBT, like for the whole basket, what's your target? What?
I have no targets.
Okay.
I wouldn't know. I wouldn't even begin to guess. Yeah.
So the second question, Marcus, could you go back to the third or fourth slides when you explained about the NFT? Yes, here. So here the invoice is signed, and what kind of signature do you store on the blockchain?
A cryptographic signature.
Okay, more specifically, what kind of anonymization do you provide, if any, to hide identities of the users?
Okay, so so right now it's really just if paper records, new Spotify's node identity on Ethereum. one thing that we're working on that I think is cool is having privacy preserving ways of doing that building our own chain, actually.
Building, sorry, what?
Our own chain.
Okay.
Because right now it's really hard to implement privacy preserving features on Ethereum directly. So that applies to the node identities as well as the NFTs themselves, as well as potentially payments on Ethereum itself.
Okay, so for the moment you don't have privacy.
Not
Like
in
strict
that
privacy.
sense. I mean, it's private in the sense that you would have to know the node identity of Spotify. But once you figure it out,
Yeah, once
that
you-
could be leaked. So yeah. I mean, minimal amount of privacy right now, but we are building our own chain to allow that.
Are you already started building it?
Yeah, we're using Substrate.
Okay. Why Substrate?
I gave that talk yesterday. We looked at a bunch of things, but we found that it's a lot of development overhead to build your own chain, and Substrate just makes that much easier. They have a lot of things just out of the box that made it, I mean, still a lot of development effort, but much less, and providing a lot of tools that we can use. Any other questions? Cool, thank you.
Thank you.